In this video, we will be examining Texas independence and the Mexican-American War. The questions that you should be able to answer by the end of this video are: why does Mexico attack the settlers that it invited to Texas? What was Polk's main goal as president? What did the United States get after war with Mexico? Why was this new territory dangerous for the United States? And how does expansion threaten the stability of the United States? The key terms that you should be able to define by the end of the video are the Texas War for Independence, Santa Anna, the Alamo, James K. Polk, the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Mexican Cession, and Wilmot Proviso. I'd like to begin by taking a look at how and why Texas gained independence from Mexico. So just a little bit of background. In 1821, Mexico wins independence from Spanish colonial rule, and it becomes its own independent country known as the Republic of Mexico. After gaining independence, Mexico experiences two really important things. The first is that trade increases between the northern Mexican provinces and the United States. And the second is that this new independent Mexican government has difficulty governing its vast lands. For generations before Mexican independence, foreigners were kept out of northern Mexican provinces, and Americans really weren't interested in settling there because Secretary of State John Quincy Adams negotiated with Spain and got Spain to give the United States Florida, and in turn, the United States would relinquish their claim to North Mexico. However, after the Republic of Mexico won its independence in 1821, it announced that Americans were now welcome in North Mexico, or what we know as Texas. The reason Mexico invites American settlers and colonists into Texas is to make sure it was a settled territory that the United States would have to back off from. One of the most famous examples of this is in 1821, an ambitious ex-newspaperman from Missouri named Stephen Austin settled 297 American families and their slaves on the Brazos River in East Texas. In exchange for the land, they agreed to convert to Catholicism and pledge allegiance to the Republic of Mexico. Under the same terms, Mexico granted others the right to settle in Texas, but soon the plan began to backfire. Thousands of American squatters now came, carving out their own homesteads without anyone's permission. By 1835, there were more than 35,000 American-born immigrants and their slaves living in Texas. That means there were more than 10 times the number of Spanish-speaking Tejanos. As settlers continue to settle in Texas, there begins to become a lot of friction between Americans and Mexicans. At this point, Americans want to extend U.S. boundaries to the Rio Grande River into areas of Texas. In 1825, now President John Quincy Adams offers to buy Texas for $1 million, and Mexico refuses. And then later, President Jackson offers to buy Texas for $5 million, and again, Mexico refuses. There's also a lot of increased tensions occurring between Mexicans and Americans over issues like slavery, immigration, and local rights. So in terms of local rights, the Americans living in Texas, or Texans, believed in states' rights, while Mexicans favored a strong central government. Perhaps more important was the issue of slavery. Mexico outlawed slavery in 1830 and prohibited the import of slaves into Texas, but Texans refused to listen to Mexico. In April of 1830, Mexico kind of has enough, and they seal their borders among fear that Americans would take over Texas. They also place an import tax on American goods. But Texans refuse to abide by Mexico's decree yet again. Amidst these rising tensions between Mexicans and Americans, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is elected president of Mexico in 1835. At first, he promised greater autonomy for Texas, but later he declares himself the dictator of Mexico. As the dictator of Mexico, Santa Anna outlaws all local rights. rebels and raised an army to exert control in Texas. When Texans rebelled and talked of independence, Santa Anna led an army of 5,300 men north into Texas. In response to General Santa Anna leading an army into Texas, Texas declares independence from Mexico in 1836. Sam Houston, who had fought in the War of 1812, served in Congress, and served as governor of Tennessee, was put in command of the Texas forces. As Santa Anna's 6,000-man army moves into Texas, Sam Houston calls for more men from Texas and from the United States to help fight. But Andrew Jackson ordered a policy of strict neutrality. He wanted to buy Texas, but he didn't want to fight a war over it. Despite the official policy of neutrality, many young American men volunteered to serve in Sam Houston's forces, and American popular opinion nullified existing U.S. neutrality policy. General Santa Anna intends to drive Americans or Tejanos out of Texas. He even goes so far as to arrest impresarios like Stephen Austin for promoting revolution. As a result, Texas breaks out in rebellions. One of the most famous rebellions occurred in San Antonio at the Alamo. In February of 1836, 146 American or Texan men gathered at the old Spanish mission, the Alamo, to stop Santa Anna's army from seizing Texas. The Texans were poorly equipped. There were only 200 Texans versus the 6,000 troops Santa Anna brought in. On March 2, 1836, Texans declared independence for the Republic of Texas, and Santa Anna responds by having him and his men swarm the garrison. As a result, 187 Texans die, including Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, and Commander William Travis. Sam Houston, the commander of the Texan army, is able to find a little more success than his fellow Texans who had taken over the Alamo. His army emerges victorious in the Battle of San Jacinto. Using the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," to rally his troops, Sam Houston and his army are able to kill 630 Mexican troops and capture 700 more, in a battle that only lasts 18 minutes. The day after the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texans capture Santa Anna and make him sign a treaty granting Texas its independence. Santa Anna signs the Treaty of Velasco on May 14, 1836. The terms of the treaty force Santa Anna to withdraw his troops from Texas, and it also allows Texas to become an independent nation known as the Lone Star State, with the Rio Grande as Texas's southern border. 1 year after Texas wins independence from Mexico and becomes its own independent nation, it petitions to be annexed by the United States in 1837. And the main reason for that is that Texas feared Mexico's larger and superior military forces. Now, the issue here is that Texas wants to be admitted as a slave state, which stirs up sectionalism between the anti-slavery Whigs in the North who opposed annexation and the Southern Democrats who welcomed it. To make matters even more complicated, Mexico refused to recognize Texas's independence and threatened war if Texas joined the Union. Ultimately, the United States rejects Texas's request to join the Union, and that's mainly because the United States didn't want to disturb the sectional balance between slave states and free states. So the independent Republic of Texas lasts for 9 years, from 1836 to 1845. During this time, Texas signs treaties with France, the Netherlands, and England for protection. And the reason Texas was able to do that was because these European powers were interested in Texas as a buffer zone against further U.S. expansion. Finally, by 1845, President John Tyler got a joint resolution through Congress to annex Texas. Thus, Texas was already a part of the United States by the time James K. Polk took the oath of office in March 1845. After Texas became a part of the United States, Mexico claimed that the U.S. had unjustly taken Texas and refused to recognize its annexation. All right, so here I just wanted to show you a map of where Mexico was and where the disputed territory between the Republic of Texas and Mexico was. You can see that Mexico had a lot of territory in what is now the US's southwest region, and it slowly begins to be taken over by the United States. All right, so now we're going to shift our attention to President James K. Polk and the Mexican-American War, which he starts basically to get more land for the United States. So let's start by talking about who President Polk is. He was the 11th President of the United States, serving from 1845 to 1849. He was a slave owner from Tennessee who served as the Democratic candidate for president in the 1844 election. He manages to win this election by focusing his campaign on the idea of manifest destiny. So his main policy goals are to get more land for the United States. He wanted to annex Texas, which, as you should know, was an independent republic at this point, and he also wanted to claim as much extra Western land as possible. Opponents of Polk's claimed that his policies would cause a civil war by upsetting the balance between free states and slave states, but he manages to win anyway. After President Polk was elected, but before he enters office, Congress was worried that he would only add slave states to the Union, so they tried to take care of the Texas issue before he took office. So in 1845, President Tyler, during his lame duck period, makes a deal with Congress to pass a joint resolution to admit Texas as a slave state and Oregon as a free state. This maintains the sectional balance between free states and slave states. So when Polk comes into office, Texas is already a part of the Union. Now, as soon as Polk enters office, his presidential promise to acquire Texas has already been fulfilled. Still, Polk isn't satisfied with just that. Instead, he seeks to acquire more territory from Mexico, and he wants to buy California, which is seen as a gateway to the Pacific. The issue here is that Mexico is still fuming from Texas's annexation and has severed diplomatic ties to the United States. Still, Polk tries to acquire California, and he sends an envoy to Mexico City in 1845 to buy California for $25 million. As expected, Mexico rejects the offer. Feeling slighted, Polk looks for a reason to go to war with Mexico to take California the hard way. In April 1846, President Polk sends troops to a disputed border region between the United States and Mexico. Mexican troops cross the Rio Grande and attack one of General Zachary Taylor's patrols, resulting in 16 American casualties. In response, President Polk sends his war message to Congress, and Congress overwhelmingly votes for a declaration of war against Mexico. Even though the majority of Congress was overwhelmingly in favor of declaring war on Mexico, public opinion was pretty polarized. A majority of Whigs opposed the war, and they were known as conscience Whigs. Some Whigs questioned if the war had begun on U.S. territory and if Polk had started the war under false pretenses. Basically, they weren't sure if that violent scuffle in the disputed border area was started by American troops or Mexican troops. Many believed that the United States had no legal right to land south of the Nueces River, and they also feared that slavery in the newly conquered areas could lead to a sectional crisis. Southern expansionists, on the other hand, were eager to take more Mexican territory. Finally, Mexico wanted to humiliate the United States for the Texas issue, and they were hoping that the United States would erupt into a destructive war. So once war is declared, Polk gets the American army to go down and invade Mexico, and this is the beginning of the Mexican-American War, which lasts from 1846 to 1848. During the war, the United States conquers California and occupies parts of Mexico, and by 1847, the American army is able to defeat Mexican forces and occupy Mexico City. At this point, Mexico is forced to sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, on February 2, 1848. This treaty basically says that America would pay Mexico $15 million in exchange for a huge chunk of Mexico's northern territory. This big piece of territory is known as the Mexican Cession. The treaty was approved in the Senate despite a bitter debate between Whigs who disapproved of the war and even threatened to cut off supplies to U.S. forces in Mexico, and expansionists in the South who clamored for all of Mexico, not just the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession includes a huge chunk of the United States, including New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Colorado, and most importantly, the very rich and fertile area of California. Now, this territory is kind of problematic because it ignites the slavery issue. Most of this new territory lies in the south of the United States, so it meant that these states might become slave states. That means that the Mexican Cession runs the risk of upsetting the balance between free states and slave states in the United States. And if that balance is upset and one side feels like it's losing out to the other, it could possibly cause a civil war. This issue is why Ralph Waldo Emerson, a famous transcendentalist and author, said, "Mexico will poison us." He believed that taking this land from Mexico was like swallowing poison. It would eventually kill the nation by splitting it apart. And he was not too far off. Even though the Mexican-American War seems like it's good for the United States on its surface, it actually causes a lot of problems and almost splits the U.S. in half. Abolitionists saw the Mexican-American War as a conspiracy of Southern slave owners who wanted to enter in this war to gain territory in order to expand slavery westward. In response to this fear, the Wilmot Proviso was introduced into Congress. Now, what the Wilmot Proviso is it's a law that was proposed to make sure that slavery could never exist in any of the territory gained from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso passed in the House, but it didn't make it past the Senate. In turn, Southerners began to resent Northern attempts to prevent the expansion of slavery. As a result of the Mexican-American War, the U.S.'s territory increased by 1/3. The Mexican Cession was bigger than the Louisiana Purchase. As a result, sentiment for expansion began to increase in the U.S., and Latin America began to negatively view the U.S. Finally, U.S. forces became more experienced in times of war. The key takeaways you should be getting from this video are: 1. The U.S. added large territories in the West through victory in the Mexican-American War and diplomatic negotiations, raising questions about the status of slavery, American Indians, and Mexicans in the newly acquired lands. And 2. The Mexican Cession led to heated controversies over whether to allow slavery in the newly acquired territories.